demo video of the Grader Project 3, just because it seemed a little challenging. So let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to have to read off the steps to you, and I'll just display the Excel spreadsheet as I'm doing the steps. So since I already have the file open and saved, I'll go ahead and start with step 2. And it says, on the subtotals worksheet, use the sort dialog box to sort the data by employee and further sort by category, both in alphabetical order. So let's go through our tabs here. And let's see, so on my data tab, oops, I'm sorry, I went to the wrong one here. Let's stay on the, I was thinking of subtotals. Let's stay on the home tab. And here's my sort and filter. So I'm going to select all the data as well too, or the entire range. And let's go to the sort and filter button and do the custom sort. And so first it wants me to sort the data by employee in alphabetical order. So I'll select employee, and it's already A to Z. And then I need to add a level, and then further sort by category, again in alphabetical order. So it looks like that's everything for step 2. It's sorted first by employee, and then by category. So step 3 says use the subtotal features to insert subtotal rows by employee to calculate the total expense by employee. So this one's worded kind of weird. So let's think it through kind of word by word, and we'll figure out the steps. So let's just first start by finding the subtotals. And that is under the data tab all the way at the end here in the outline group. So if I click on the subtotals button, and if I'm looking at my instructions, it wants me to insert subtotals row by employee. So it looks like it defaulted to expense. So I'm going to change that to employee. And it wants me to calculate the total expense value by employee. So now I got to read between the lines here a little bit. So total, I'm going to assume is synonymous with sum. And they want me to total the expense by employee. So it looks like it's defaulting to category here. So I'm going to change that to expense. And then let's go ahead and hit OK, and we'll run it and see how it comes out. So it looks like I'm OK here. So I've got each one of the employees separated. So I start with Abbott, Donaldson, Hart, Miller, Overton, and right below each one gives me a total category for each employee. So it looks like I'm OK on step 3. So let's go ahead and move on to step 4. They want us to collapse the Donaldson and Hart sections to show only their totals. Leave the other employee individual rows displayed. So you can see it's broken up by employee. So they want me to collapse this one, the Donaldson and the Hart. So if I go over to the far left-hand side of the screen, I've got these little minus signs, so I can collapse it, each one of the employees like that. So I'm going to collapse Donaldson and Hart. So now I just have their total rows and not each one of the individual categories. So that is it for step 4. So step 5, they want us to use the expenses worksheet to create a blank pivot table on a new worksheet named summary. name the pivot table categories. So again, this is one that's kind of long-winded, but it's one of the more simple steps here, but it's one that's easy to overthink. So first they want us to move over to this expenses worksheet here. And I'm going to go and insert a pivot table. So I went over to the insert tab in the tables group and I selected pivot table. And it went ahead and defaulted to the correct range. And it defaults to a new worksheet. So I'm going to say OK. Next, it wants me to name the worksheet summary. So they're talking about the new worksheet that I created for this pivot table. So it's going to default to sheet name 1. So I'm going to rename it summary. Be really careful when you're doing this. Make sure it's spelled and capitalized. There's no extra spaces in this, because at this point, if you spell the name of the worksheet wrong, it won't give you credit for any of the steps that you do on this pivot table if the worksheet is named improperly. So just be mindful of all the little details from this point on. So let's do the last little step in part step 5. It says name the pivot table categories. So if I remember right, I'm going to right click here. And let's go down. So all I did was right click in the little area here where it says pivot table. Let's go to pivot table options. And it looks like that worked. So right here, the very first field is a pivot table name. And they want us to change the name from the default name to categories. So I'm going to check it, make sure everything is spelled correctly. Again, that's where most of your mistakes are going to come from. It's going to be a misspelling as opposed to the technique being done improperly. So again, just to emphasize the notion of just being mindful of the little tiny details, because unfortunately the software picks up on some of those instead of being more discreet and picking up the fact that you're probably doing the method right. It'll sometimes mark things incorrect if there's a misspelling. So let's go ahead and hit OK. We can check it. So it changes the name to categories. So let's move on to step 6. Step 6 says use the category and expense fields, enabling Excel to determine where the fields go in the pivot table. Again, this is worded kind of weird again, but all they're telling us to do is do this in order. So they want us to use the category and expense fields, enabling Excel to determine where the fields go. So they're telling us they want us to do this in order, and Excel will determine where the fields will be placed in this pivot table on its own. So let's just click on the expenses field first. So that's over here, right here in this pivot table fields area on the right hand side. So I'm just going to select expenses. Oops, actually I did that wrong. Oops, sorry, they want us to do category first and then expense. So it defaults to, it puts the category field in the rows section and the expense in the values section. So again, that's one that's worded kind of weird, but it's really just a really simple step that I even screwed up trying to do it. So just be careful with ones like that. So let's move on to step 7. It says modify the values field to determine the average expense by category. Change the custom name to average expense. So it looks like there's 2 parts to this. They want us to modify the values field to determine the average expense. So let's start with that. So I'm going to go over to the right hand side, this pivot table fields section. I'm down here in the values field area, and right now it's defaulting to the sum of the expense. If I hit this little drop down arrow and I get the value field settings, they want us to change this to the average expense. So right now it's set at sum. So I'm going to change it to average. And next they want us to change the custom name to average expense. So right now it's average of expense. They want us to change this to, just take out the of there and just make it average expense. So be careful here, make sure you just have one space in between average and expense. Again, just like the other little trivial steps, they'll take off points if there's an extra space here or misspelling. So let's move on to step 8, format the value fields to accounting number type. So I still have this dialog box open, the value field settings dialog box. And I'm going to click on this number format button in the lower left hand corner. And I'm going to select accounting. And I'm going to have it defaults to 2 decimal places. I'm going to leave it like that because it doesn't say anything about changing the decimal places. And it looks like there's some values beyond the decimal point here. So I'm going to go ahead and leave it as is. And then it looks like we're done as far as messing with the settings of this field. So I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. And you can see that kind of cleans it up here a little bit. So step 9 says type the word category in cell A3 and change the grand totals layout option to on for rows only. So let's start with the first part. I'm just going to, so it looks like cell A3 is already selected. So they just want me to change the title of this column to category. So, okay. Change the grand totals layout option to on for rows only. So let's see if I remember how to do this right. Let's click on the design tab. Okay. So if I click on the design tab, I want to make sure that I have a cell selected too in the pivot table so that I have these options to work with the pivot table. And if I go over to the layout section, it says grand totals, and they want me to select on for rows only. So moving on to step 10, they want me to apply pivot style dark 2 and display banded rows. They have a little note down here too. It says depending upon the version of Office being used, the style name may be light blue pivot style dark 2. So that's probably the one we're going to want to, that's probably the name we're going to want to look for, is this light blue pivot style dark 2. So here's our pivot table styles group, and I'm going to hit the drop down here. So they're telling me dark. So I'm going to go ahead, I'm not even going to go to the light and the medium. And I'm going to drag my cursor over each one of the styles. So here's light blue, pivot style, dark 2. So I've applied that, and next they want me to display banded rows. So here's I'm going to go over to the pivot table style options and display banded rows. So let's move on to step 11. Insert a slicer for the employee field. Change the slicer height to 2 inches and apply the slicer style dark 5. Move the slicer below the pivot table. And let's read the note here as well. It says, depending on the version of Office being used, the style name may be light blue slicer style dark 5. I'm assuming we're going to look for this light blue slicer style dark 5. So let's insert a slicer first. And let's do this. Let's look it up. So I don't even know if I remember how to do that. How to insert a slicer in Excel. So I'm pretty sure I know how to do this, but I want you guys to just see that if I don't, I can always look it up and find a video or some instructions on how to do that. So it says click anywhere in the pivot table for which you want to insert a slicer. Click on the pivot table analyze tab, insert slicer. So let's just start with that. That should be enough to get us through here. So it tells us to go to the pivot table, analyze, and it looks like here in the filter group, there's an insert slicer tab. So if I go back to my instructions, they want me to insert a slicer for the employee field. So I'm going to select the employee field. And next they want me to change the slicer height to 2 inches and apply slicer dark 5. Move the slicer below the pivot table. Okay. So let's say OK. And so once I hit OK, here's my slicer, or the field that I sliced out of that. And then it gives me some options to work with the slicer now once I have it selected. So they want me to change the height to 2 inches. So I'm going to hit 2 and then enter. And then you can see it makes the rows for each one of the field names a little bit larger. And they want me to change the style, so I'm going to go over to the slicer style to 14. So to be exact, it's light blue, slicer style dark 5. Actually, I'm sorry. So I'm going to go through the dark, and you can see I'm just running my cursor over each one of the options. So I'm going to go over to the 5th one, and it's light blue, slicer style dark 5. So that makes each one of the boxes a little bit darker. And I'm going to move the slicer over below the pivot table. Okay. So let's move on to step 12. So they want us to use the expenses worksheet to create another blank pivot table on a sheet named totals. Add the employee to the rows and add the expense field to the values area. Sort the pivot table from largest to smallest. Okay. So again, this is one that's kind of easy to overthink, but let's just go step by step. So they want us to start with the expenses table again. So they want us to create another pivot table. So I'm going to go to the Insert tab, Pivot Table. They want us to put it on another worksheet. So it defaults to putting it on another worksheet. So I'm going to say OK. And it says it wants us to name this new sheet totals. So let's rename it capital T totals. Add employee to the rows. So I can do this as well too. I'm going to just select employee. I'm going to hold down my mouse and bring it over to rows. And I'm going to bring the expense fields over to the value. So I'm going to select the expense field and bring it over to values. And they want me to sort the pivot table from largest to smallest. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over, I'm going to just select a cell in the pivot table. I'm going to right click it, and I'm going to sort. So after I right click it, it brings me a drop down and it wants me to sort from largest to smallest. So I've got it sorted by expenses from largest to smallest now, so it looks like we're good with step 13. So I'm sorry, from step 12. So step 13 wants us to change the name for the expenses column to totals and format the field with accounting number format. So I'm going to go back over to my pivot table fields, and expenses is my values category. So I'm going to hit the drop down and select the value field settings. And so it defaults to the sum of expenses as the default name. And I am going to change that to totals. And then I'm going to hit the number format and change it to accounting. And then let's hit OK. So we've changed the name so it's a little bit cleaner, and we've got some formatting on our values. So let's move on to step 14. They want us to insert a calculated field to subtract 2,659 and 72 cents from the expense field. Format the field with the custom name above or below average and apply account number format to the field. So let's start just by creating the calculated field here. So let's click anywhere in the pivot table, and we've already got this pivot table analyze tab selected, and if we go over to fields, items, and sets, we'll click it and get a drop down, and we'll hit calculated field. So I'm not going to change the field name here. I'm going to have it leave it as the default name. I'm just going to work with setting up the formula for this calculated field. So they want me to subtract a value from the expense field. So I'm going to select the expense field minus 2659.72. And I'm going to hit OK. So it defaults to the sum of field 1 as the default name. And so next they want me to format the field with the custom name above or below average and apply accounting number format to the field. So let's go back over to the pivot table fields. So I'm back on the right hand side here. If you see my cursor, I'm going to select the drop down. I'm going to select the value field settings. And let's start by naming it above or below average. Again, check it really closely, make sure everything's capitalized or not capitalized, no extra spaces, everything's exactly like it says, like the instructions tell you to name it. And they want us to apply account number format. So it looks like it already has it set to that, but let's check it just to be sure. So it already has accounting number formatting selected. So it looks like we're okay. So let's go ahead and hit OK. So step 15 says set 12.29 as the column width, as the width for column B and C. Change the row height of rows 3 through 30 and apply word wrap to cell C3. So this is a pretty simple step, again one that's kind of easy to overthink. So let's just start by setting the column width for column B and C to 12.29. So this is just like something any other data set you've changed the column width to. So I'm going to select columns B and C, right click to get the drop down, and then select column width and select 12.29 is the column width. And for some reason they don't want us to select just these rows where the pivot table is. They want us to go from row 3 all the way down to row 30. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to change the row height from 14.5 to 30. And finally, they want me to apply word wrap to cell C3. So I'm going to select cell C3, and I'm going to right click it. I'm going to go to Format Cells, and in the dialog box, I'm going to select Alignment. I'm going to wrap the text. So you can see we're missing some of the text. Don't worry about that. It didn't ask us to change this yet. So just leave it how it is, even though we're missing the above or, and all we can see is the below average. Let's leave it how it is for now. Again, even though it looks a little bit weird. If it doesn't ask you to do it, don't do it. So let's move on to step 16. It says create a cluster column pivot chart from the pivot table. Move the chart to a new sheet named chart. Hide all filled buttons in chart if necessary. So there's a note here for Mac users. Read that if you're having trouble, or if you're using a Mac. Hopefully this will help. I'm not going to get into this note since I'm working on a PC, but if you are using a Mac, please refer to this note that's below step 16 here. So let's create a clustered column pivot chart from the pivot table. So I'm going to make sure that I have the pivot table or a cell on the pivot table selected. And I'm going to go to the Insert tab here. And I'm going to go to the Charts group. I'm going to hit the pivot table or the pivot chart drop down and select pivot chart. And it defaults to the cluster column here. So let's go ahead and hit OK. So it also says that it wants me to put this pivot table on a new sheet and name the sheet chart. So let's see. I'm going to go ahead and cut this. I'm going to go down to the bottom here where there's this little plus sign. I'm going to hit new sheet. And I'm going to paste the pivot table with the original source formatting. So the option that says keep source formatting. And they want me to change the name of this sheet to charts. So let's rename it charts. Enter. And the last step is they want me to hide all filled buttons in the pivot chart if necessary. So I'm going to make sure that I have the pivot chart selected, and I believe that's on. Here we go. So if I have the pivot chart selected, and I select the pivot chart analyze tab here, and I go to this last little group, show hide. I hit the filled buttons button. Sounds weird, but I'm going to go down to the hide all option. So it looks like that's it for step 16. So step 17 says add a chart title above the chart and type expenses by employee. Change the chart style to style 14. So I'm going to hit this little plus sign, and that gives me the option to add a chart title. So select this all and change it to expenses by employee. And again, be careful, make sure that you spell and capitalize or don't capitalize everything properly. And then don't hit enter because it'll put a space down there. Just click anywhere else in the pivot table and it'll take you out of that field. So next they want us to change the chart style to style 14. So with the pivot table, the pivot chart selected, let's go to design and here's the chart styles. And so it looks like they're just numbered. So this last one here is style 14. So it looks like it just kind of highlights the columns here so they stand out a little bit more with that style. So step 18 wants us to apply 11-point font size to the value axis and display vertical axis as accounting with 0 decimal places. So again, this is kind of a long-winded instruction for something that's kind of simple. So I'm just going, here's my value axis, just because this is text, these are values, hence I'm defaulting to this as the value axis. So they want us to change the font size to 11. So just like changing any font size in any application, I'm just going to go back to the Home tab, change it to 11. And they want us to change this to accounting style with 0 decimal places. So it looks like we have 2 decimal places here right now. So with this selected, let's see, let's go back here over to our pivot chart fields. I'm going to go back just like we were working with the value settings. I'm going to select this above or below average because that's the name of our value axis. I'm going to hit the value field settings again. Let's hit the number format. So we're already defaulting to accounting, but they want us to take out the 2 decimal places. So I'm going to change that to 0 and OK. It doesn't look like it did it though. Let me try it again. So 0, OK, and OK. Huh. So let's try this a different way. I'm going to right click on this. And let's go to this format chart area. Oops. I'm sorry. I want to make sure that I have this selected. So that was my fault. So I'm going to make sure I have this value, vertical value axis selected. And if I right click it, let's go to format axis. Let's try it this way. Once I do that, you'll see it brings up this format axis option. So I'm going to go down to the very bottom here and hit this numbers button, and it's going to give me an option to, hopefully this will work. So it's already set to accounting style or category. So I'm going to hit 0 and hit enter and OK. So it looks like that worked. So I'm going to close that out because I think that's all I have to do with that. So you can see doing it that way did remove the decimal points. So when you're stuck on things, just remember there's always a couple different ways to try things. So I wanted you guys to see me kind of working through this as well too. If I couldn't figure that out, I would have just Googled it, and hopefully they would have given me a video or a demonstration, but I was able to figure it out just kind of by messing around with some of the drop downs. So it looks like we're almost done. So on step 19, they want us to create a footer on all worksheets with your name in the left section, the sheet name code in the center section, and the file name code in the right section. Okay, so they want us to put this footer on every single one of these sheets down here. So right now I'm on the chart sheet. So what I want to do is hold down Control, and I'm going to select every single one of the worksheets here. So I had to hold down Control and then click on each one with my mouse. So let's go, I believe it's page layout, and let's go to page setup and hit the little corner here of the page setup group to bring up the page setup dialog box. And let's go to header footer, and they want us to do, let me see again, a footer. So I'm going to hit custom footer. I'm going to type my name on the left side, and in the center I want the sheet name. So that's this button here. I can drag my cursor over each one, and it gives me, unfortunately it's a little hidden here, but I can still make that out as sheet name. And on the right side, they want us to put the file name code. So it looks like it's, this one says insert file, this one says insert file name. So it's this one that's got the little green, looks like the Excel symbol here, and you can see my cursor on it here now. So I'm going to hit OK. And again, you want to make sure that you have all the worksheets selected, and that will put the footer on every single one of the worksheets in this workbook. So let's go ahead and organize these as well too, because I think that's the final step here. So it says step 20, ensure that the worksheets are correctly named and placed in the following order in the workbook. So they want subtotals, summary, chart. So we have chart 4th right now. So I'm just going to hold it down and move it over in front of the totals. That's next, and then expenses are last. So that is it for this one. So go ahead and save all your work, close out the workbook, and go ahead and submit. Hopefully this demonstration helps you guys on this exercise, and if you have any other questions, email me. If we need to talk over the phone or set up a Zoom conference, let's do it. If not, again, hopefully this helps, and let me know if you have any questions. All right, thanks.